Hello, my name is Chris Smith. I'm very happy to be participating in this panel at Pasic with my old friend Kay Stonefelt and with these distinguished co-presenters. I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking from the tribal lands of the Kiowa and Comanche for an audience gathered on the ancestral lands of the Potawatomi, Shawnee, Kickapoo, Delaware, Winnebago, among others, and I vow to continue the work of reparations for the dislocation, suffering, and erasure which my own ancestors imposed on the land's indigenous people. I'd also like to begin with a content acknowledgement. Though I've selected my images and direct quotations with the intention of providing illumination and insight, I do recognize that in the history of my own nation, racism appears unexpectedly and too often unremarkedly, and I am mindful of the complex and sometimes painful histories which these images recall. My presentation is entitled Hands and Feet, Skins and Boards, Historical Ethnomusicology in the Pre-Electrical Era. I've spent a number of years developing a series of principles and procedures that would help me think about musical behavior which was not notated and was only sometimes and inaccurately described, and about ways to begin to recover those vernacular and street musics through other means. Today, I'm speaking as a scholar of vernacular music and as someone who's spent decades exploring the reconstruction of older styles through the world of historical performance practice. And so I'm going to lay out some principles and procedures which I employ in looking at these two-dimensional frozen images and in seeking to recover from them sound and movement. I'm also going to look at particular tropes in particular traditions, that is, elements of sound, motion, and the body which recur across situations and which are sometimes shared across unexpected boundaries. I proceed from the assumption that it is possible to assess the accuracy of an image's reporting, using many of the same criteria we might employ in assessing a primary source prose text's accuracy. Can the reporter be trusted? Is their observation accurate? Do they have the technical artistic ability and the expressive priority of rendering performance behavior accurately? If, through reflecting upon such questions, we're able to establish a visual reporter's access to and accurate representation of performance behavior, we can recover a surprisingly rich trove of information about both performance practice and even movement and sound. Now, in the particular tradition about which I'll primarily be speaking, in which I'm emphasizing the reconstruction of music sounds in the worlds of North American vernacular musics, employing the melding of analytical tools from iconography, archival studies, and even kinesthetics, images are sometimes our best resources. In other words, I am often going to be looking at the interaction between instruments and bodies. True, these are two-dimensional silent and frozen images, from which I'm arguing it may be possible to reconstruct three-dimensional sound and motion. So how do I do this? Well, I begin by thinking about the interaction between organology, that is, the study of music instruments and their reconstruction, and orthopedics, by which I mean colloquially the way the body operates naturally. Many years ago, when Kay and I were both at Indiana University's Jacobs School of Music, one of my own teachers, the late Thomas Binkley, a specialist in medieval performance practice, told me, a converted jazz guitar player approaching medieval plucked stringed instruments I'd never before encountered, play what the instrument wants to play. That is to say, in most vernacular traditions, instrumentalists did not seek a technically complex or challenging performance practice. Technical virtuosity is not valued as an aesthetic in and of itself. Rather, the vernacular instrumentalist will find the most efficient and orthopedically supported means of their body interacting with the instrument. So therefore, if we have an image or a reconstruction of an older instrument, our body's interaction with that instrument in turn can often tell us, just as Tom Binkley said, what the instrument wanted to play. And so here is an example, a painting by the Long Island, New York vernacular painter and musician William Sidney Mount from 1856. It depicts a young banjo player whose name was George Freeman, a member of a small unincorporated community of free blacks living on the south shore of the island, who himself worked for Mount's uncle. Freeman is playing on an instrument meticulously rendered from a real model, an 1850s Boucher banjo, the first mass-produced banjos constructed by that Baltimore country, with a drumhead-style resonating pot, replacing the idiosyncrasies of the so-called tack-head gourd banjo. Now, we can check Mount's own reporting accuracy by making note of his own biographical experiences as a flute player and fiddle player, by the literally hundreds of sketches of black and white musicians in his papers, and by the actual physical detail with which both the banjo and its playing technique are rendered. In addition to the precise replication of the snare-style tuning lugs, the fretless fingerboard, the gut and silken steel strings, and the violin-style pegs, The physical technique George Freeman is employing is likewise consistent with the oldest African American banjo style called knocking, in which the nail of the curved index finger strikes downward percussively at the strings, with the trailing thumb plucking the short chanterelle string to yield complex African-inspired polyrhythms. We can employ the same combination of organological and orthopedic analysis in older images of percussion instruments, for some of which we have, and for others of which we lack, technical descriptions of performance practice. The Irish drum called the bowran, for example, about which we've already heard so wonderfully from Cara, originates as a folk instrument constructed from a grain sieve and employed by the seasonal house visiting troops called mummers or wren boys. Subsequently, other round, shallow frame drums with other tacked-on or lugged heads, sometimes adopted from other traditions, and sometimes maintaining the hand-built nature of the original mummers' drums, were likewise adopted, and they were played with a variety of performance techniques, some of which can still be heard on early recordings. But right now I'd like to cross the Atlantic westward, just as Ulster Scots and later Gaelic speakers from the west of Ireland did, first to the southwest slope of the Appalachians, and then subsequently along the routes of the Erie Canal, the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, and eventually the railroads, to look at an image by another vernacular painter, George Caleb Bingham, who traveled extensively and painted on topics from the Missouri River. Like Mount, Bingham was a commercial painter, and when he found a topic that sold well, he made the most of it. This is an image he painted several times, with this particular version being possibly the best known, the Jolly Flatboat Men from 1846. It depicts a rather romanticized and idealized scene of river workers celebrating the end of the day, with one boatman dancing with upraised arms in the style of a Scottish Highland fling, with resonant-sounding leather heels on the roof of the boat's cabin. But I'd like to zero in for a moment upon the peculiar technique of the man with the frying pan. What we can see here is that the man in the heart with the red scarf is playing the frying pan, held vertically and dangling from the left hand, with the forefinger knuckle of the right hand. This is a technique associated with bowran playing from the very early stages, completely independent of the double-headed beater called the tipper. Now, leaving aside for the moment the question of whether playing with a knuckle upon the bottom of a cast iron pan would be dermatologically disastrous, I rather think it might be, we can clearly infer that Bingham is thinking of the single-headed frame drum as he represents this impromptu, fiddle-based music-making. In another context and with more time, I might use this image to unpack the degree of fiction present in this image. I suspect, for example, that Bingham did not ever see anyone playing the frying pan in this way, but had seen a single-headed shallow frame drum used in such a fashion, and made the leap to reimagining the drum as a frying pan for purposes of this romantic image. In thinking about the tropes and recurrent patterns which shaped my research, I noticed the recurrence of depictions across the color line of leather-shod feet on resonant wooden surfaces, floors and barns, wharves, and ship's decks. The presence of these resonating wooden surfaces, combined with a body posture which emphasizes bent angles, crooked limbs, and a general syncopated disruption of even flow, I began to see again and again in these visual polyrhythmics. Sometimes the percussive sound is bare feet on packed earth next to a river in 1792 Tidewater, Virginia. Sometimes it's the cover of sheet music depicting the very early blackface practitioners. In most cases, both the visual artists and their subjects are intentionally contrasting their body vocabularies upon resonant surfaces in opposition to Eurocentric body models. The case becomes particularly interesting when we begin to think about these syncopated body vocabularies as they're framed in various types of performance contexts and soundscapes. Mount himself repeatedly employed barns as both visual frame, rather in the form of a theatrical proscenium, and as a space in which resonating wooden floors and open high ceilings would yield particular percussive soundscapes. We'll return to this image, Dance of the Haymakers, in a moment. Dancing on the barn floor is a similar context, and on the surface suggests the upright, symmetrical, and smooth flowing lines of European body aesthetics. But when in a moment we look a little deeper and think about both settings and possible backstories, interesting bodily insights emerge. One of the things that looking at these illustrations has taught me is that there were musical exchanges occurring in the streets, on the wharves, and on ship's decks, which shaped a polyglot, unique synthesis of styles. This image, now in a private collection, is entitled Dancing for Eels 1820 Catherine Market. It evokes the practice within which African Americans on their free days would harvest eels and clams on Long Island and then travel into New York in order to fry up the seafood and sell it on the street. These street vendors would often hire musicians and dancers to participate in the sales, literally dancing for eels to attract trade. This image is particularly revealing of Afro-American and Anglo-Celtic exchange. We're on a wharf looking out from beneath the wooden awning of a shop toward the river and the sails of the shipping that plied out to the Atlantic. There's a storage shed, and in the central foreground, an African-American man wearing the short jacket and trousers and cap of a sailor dances on the resonant wooden boards. His knees are bent in the Afro-Caribbean style, though his right hand is up in the style we've previously associated with the Highland Fling. To his left, two younger men pat juba, supplying the body percussion to accompany the dancing. To the right, several young men wearing the iconic jackets, hats, and long sideburns associated with Irish-American immigrant workers look on. Among them, there's a young boy with one hand over his head who plays the rhythm bones. What we're seeing here in this crude, very early drawing is the location, the groups, and most importantly, the literal soundscape in which a particular percussive Creole synthesis took form. That image, whether from riverbanks, the wharves of ports, or perhaps the platform of a Deep South train station, is thus a picture not only of the sights, but also the sounds of the roots of America's percussive music. In another context and with more time, I could look at Dance of the Haymakers, the sound of the fiddle, the body vocabulary of the dancers, and of the young boy playing drumsticks using military grip on the open door of the barn, and even the likely family background of that young man. But suffice it to say that even in the pre-electrical era, we can recover the sound and the soundscapes and the movement within those soundscapes which made possible these musics. The process is better documented in more recent eras, more distant, and thus more deductive in more distant eras. But as Tom Bigley taught me, when he first handed me a 1722 Italian cittern, or a 13th century long-necked lute, a Moroccan tambourine, or an Egyptian reek, such research, grounded in organology, iconography, orthopedics, and even, dare I say it, aesthetics, reminds us that musicians and dancers in all eras have used shared priorities to move across, between, and around social barriers. The history of intercultural musics is of new musical synthesis arising at the margins, and then of that music, those indigenous oral tradition art forms, being appropriated and monetized, codified and historicized by middle-class, scholarly, and even commercial culture. If we wish to reach back, to recognize perhaps for the first time, to celebrate and to reanimate and re-oralize those pre-electrical vernacular musics, this kind of historical ethnographic, iconographic work is one place to start. Thank you very much.